Hi there, students! I'm XS. That's little x, little s, which stands for extra sweet, because that's what I am. I'm a Puppy-Sensei, and I make Japanese language lessons to help you level up your abilities. How was your week off? Mine was productive. We've been getting a lot of things done for the Pathfinder series, which has been so fun to make. If you've been enjoying it, I honestly cannot wait for you to see episode 2. It is so much better than we ever expected. But that's not what we're here to talk about today. Today, we're learning Japanese. Yay! I know it's been a little bit, but last time we were talking about the verb dekiru, which means to be able to do something. It basically translates to I can. And while most often we use it in conjunction with some other verb to mean I can do that verb, we'll also occasionally see it in situations where it's used all by itself, usually when you're giving the affirmative answer as regards your ability to do something. Today, we're going to talk about another way that we can express our ability to do a specific verb. This use will require conjugation of the verb in question, so it's just a little bit more complicated. But that's okay, you're very smart, and I'm going to do my very best to help you master this conjugation. Let's get into it! Ikimashou! For today's lesson, we're going to look at the potential type conjugation for Japanese verbs. This one honestly is not very difficult, and I really think that it should kind of slot relatively well into what we already know about the conjugation of Japanese verbs, right? Since we've already covered some about Japanese verbs, I think that this should be pretty easy to pick up. I've been saying this to a lot of my students lately, but I think that the one thing that you really need to understand about Japanese verbs is that they can do a whole lot of work grammatically to convey plenty of different meanings and nuances through conjugation, whereas in English, we may have to add in small words or change the sentence structure in a way that ultimately could lead to longer sentences in English, but in Japanese we can do it kind of really quickly, right? And that's very handy. In a way, this is part of the reason that I feel that Japanese can sometimes seem like it's a little bit compact to English speakers who are learning the language. And that's because by changing even very small parts of a verb in a Japanese sentence, we can end up making changes to the semantic meaning of that sentence in a way that in English would require significantly more changes. When I'm translating a document, space on the page is something that I often need to think about, because sometimes there's something that I could say in Japanese that would require significantly less page space than it would require if I needed to say something comparable in English, right? I want to give you a quick example to highlight my point here. So this sentence is yama e ikanai. Yama e ikanai. And a good translation of this sentence might be something like, I'm not going to the mountains. All right? Before I go into any detail here, I would like to remind you of exactly what it is we're seeing in the Japanese sentence, because I know it's been a minute. Yama means mountain. That's easy, right? Yama. That's just mountain, okay? E is that directional movement particle that we often use when we're headed to some destination or towards some place, right? We often translate it as towards or to, but it always indicates movement in a direction away from where you are now, right? And then we have that verb iku. Iku is a godan verb. And when we conjugate it into the negative, we're going to need to change the ku sound to a ka sound. And so we end up with ikanai. I do not go, or I am not going, something like that, right? And so iku becomes ikanai. Now that aside, what I really want you to take note of here is the fact that yama e ikanai takes up basically half the page space when compared to the English sentence, I'm not going to the mountains, right? The English sentence looks longer on the page because it requires you to use more letters, right? Now, I want to be honest and say that's not going to be the case every single time. There are certainly things that require more page space to say in Japanese when compared to English, but for the most part, Japanese is usually going to take up significantly less space on the page. And that's mostly due to kanji, because kanji tend to convey in just 1 or 2 characters words that may end up taking in English 8 or 9 or 10 letters to say, right? Now, if we compound that difference in sentence size over a dozen or so sentences, or a page, or even the length of a novel, what you start to see is that Japanese, on average, tends in many ways to end up needing far less space to convey the same amount of information when written. Not necessarily the case when spoken, but when written, Japanese just takes up less space. And that's something that you have to think about when you're a translator, right? All of this is relevant to what we're talking about today, because today we're going to talk about making a really small change to our Japanese sentence, and it's going to really fundamentally change the meaning of the sentence. So let's take our previous sentence and let's look at how small of a change this is and what the effect is. I want you to see these side by side so that you can see exactly what changes are being made here. All I'm doing is I'm changing ikanai into ikenai. And simply by doing that, what's happening is we're changing the meaning of the sentence from I do not go to I cannot go. This is the magic of Japanese verb conjugation. Often, when I have new students of Japanese, I think they feel really overwhelmed by the sheer number of different conjugations that you need to master in order to understand verb use in Japanese. It really is a lot. There are a lot of conjugations, and it's a lot to take in, and it's a lot to think about. And it's quite different from English, where we don't have many verb conjugations. We really don't have many at all that we have to think about. So this is new, and it's difficult, and I think for a lot of students, I feel like maybe they quickly give up on Japanese because they see, oh, I've got to make all of these different conjugations and I have to memorize many things about Japanese verbs. Japanese verbs are very complicated. However, it's my humble opinion that after you've learned a number of these different conjugations, you can kind of understand that in being as complex as they are, if you know what you're doing when you speak the language and you know how the verbs behave, it starts to become really interesting how much we can do by changing just very small amounts of a verb, right? Just like changing ikanai into ikenai changes the meaning from I'm not going into I can't go, right? And being able to make those minute changes like that, I think that's really interesting at the level of language, right? It may be difficult, you may have to memorize it, but once you have it down, it kind of becomes really cool that you could just go, oh, ikenai, right? I can't go, right? You don't have to throw in extra words. You don't have to think about word order. You don't have to think about anything like that. You just conjugate the verb and you change the meaning. That's pretty neat. At least it is to me, right? Maybe you disagree, and that's okay too. However, the counterpoint to this is that because even very small changes that you undertake within the Japanese language and within verb conjugation are going to end up having relatively massive impacts on how you're ultimately going to be understood when you're speaking the language, you actually really do have to be quite careful with your pronunciation, because even a small slip up with your vowel, ikenai instead of ikanai, is going to end up impacting the meaning that you are trying to convey, and you certainly don't want that, right? If the point of language is to get your message across and have someone understand what it is that you mean, right, you want to be very careful with how your verbs come across, with how your vowels sound, with which consonant you're using, with whether or not you're using that geminate small tsu, right? Because any of those things could have an impact on what word you're saying, or what your meaning is, right? And so you want to get your message across, you want to be understood, and with that in mind, you should be very careful with your pronunciation. Unfortunately, usually that just takes practice, but over time, we get there. Yeah? So the act of getting that vowel wrong, the act of saying ikanai instead of ikanai, and having that misunderstood by a speaker of Japanese is kind of like speaking English and telling somebody that you can't do something, but you accidentally pronounce it can't do something, and then they get really confused because they think that you're making a reference to a German philosopher. Why, thank you. Anyway, this is what we're discussing today, using verbal conjugation to express our ability or our inability to do something specific. We call this the potential form, obviously because it's all about expressing our potential to do some specific verb, right? As usual, when we learn a new verb conjugation, what we're going to do today is we're going to need to learn it for all three of the Japanese verb types: ichidan verbs, godan verbs, and irregular verbs. Do you remember how those work? Right? So the ichidan verbs are the verbs that do not necessarily make a sound change, right? The godan verbs will make a vowel sound change, and that vowel will become each of the 5 different vowels. That's why they're called godan verbs, because the go in godan refers to the 5 different vowels. And then we have the irregular verbs, which we know we always have to memorize. Unfortunately, we just have to memorize how they work. However, today, as a snack, instead of learning the ichidan verb forms first, we're going to start with the godan verb forms. We've talked before about the fact that godan verbs are so called because they take all 5 of the Japanese vowel sounds. So a plain dictionary form verb like iku, to go, in the polite form would become ikimasu, right? So we can see that u sound in iku becoming an e sound in ikimasu. Likewise, we've also seen the creation of an a sound in the negative conjugation of iku as ikanai, to not go. And now we're going to learn a grammatical form that will take the e vowel, right? So let's see how that works. We've got ikimasu, which means to go, and it's in the polite form. It's in that mas form, right? And we're going to convert that into ikemasu. I can go. Also in the polite form, right? Keep that in mind. So ikimasu, polite, to go, becomes ikemasu. I can go, polite. So that's pretty easy, right? Ikimasu becomes ikemasu. It's a really simple vowel change, and it changes our verb from a declarative statement, I go, to a potential statement, I can go. And also note here that just like in English, the use of a potential verb form in Japanese will cover both your ability to do something and also your personal feasibility for being able to do that thing. In other words, ikemasu covers situations like I have the ability to go, but also situations like I have permission to go, right? So you can use ikemasu to mean I'm capable of getting there. I have a car, I have feet, I can walk, I can get there. But you could also use it in situations that are like, my parents are allowing me to go. So both of those are kind of covered under ikemasu, I can go, right? All right, so for godan verbs, creating the polite potential form is pretty easy. All you have to do is change the e sound in that imas ending into an e sound, right? So let's look at some examples of this in action. Yeah, okay. All right, what are we seeing here? We've got yomimasu. That's a verb that means to read, okay? And yomimasu becomes yomemasu in the potential form, yomemasu, ne? And that means I can read, I'm able to read, right? Hanashimasu is a verb that means to talk or to speak, right? And it's going to become hanasemasu, I can talk, right? Nihongo ga hanasemasu ka? Can you speak Japanese? I know you can because you're watching my videos. Kakimasu, right? That's a verb that means to write. And it's going to become kakemasu. I can write. Asobimasu becomes asobemasu. I can play. That's pretty easy, isn't it? It's not really hard at all. All we're doing is we're changing the E sound into an E sound. And that really holds true for any godan verb when you're creating the polite potential form. So for the polite potential form, change the E sound before mas into an E sound before mas. Yeah? Okay, so what about the plain form then? Well, for the Godon verbs, forming the plain form isn't quite as easy as creating the polite form, but it's also not too terribly hard. Okay? See, it's just one extra step. Iku is going to become ikeru. Ikeru, I can go. Yomu will become yomeru, I can read. Hanasu becomes hanaseru. Kaku is going to become kakeru. And asobu will become asoberu. So, what does that mean? How do these conjugate? Well, very simply, the final u sound becomes an e sound, and then we add ru. You see it, right? And that's basically all you have to do for Godon verbs, right? These are the two types of conjugations for the polite and for the plain. Yeah, not too hard. In plain Godon verbs, the final u sound is going to become an e sound, and then we add ru. Ne? And for polite Godon verbs, the e sound before the mas form ending is going to become an e sound. So imas becomes emas, right? Kakimas becomes kakemas. Something like that. All right? Also, we can pretty easily create the negative form to say that we can't do something, right? So just like ikenai that we looked at before, for any Godon verb, we're going to change that final u vowel into an e sound, and then we add nai. Iku, I go. Ikenai, I can't go, in the plain form. Okay? And in the polite form, for any Godon verb in the polite form, we're going to end up with ikemasen, or something like ikemasen. Ne? So ikimas becomes ikemasen. I can't go in the polite form. And that'll hold true for any Godon verb, like kakemasen. I can't write. Okay? So, I think that wraps it up for Godon verbs, and I suppose that means that we need to move on. So, next up, we're going to have all right, now, next we're going to learn to do the same thing with Ichidan verbs. In the same way, right? Polite verbs into the polite potential form, plain verbs into the plain potential form, and then both the polite and plain negative potential forms, right? So, when we're talking about making the polite potential form for Godon verbs, what we did was we converted the E sound into an E sound. Will it be the same way for Ichidan verbs? Let's see. We'll take the verb tabemas, right? Tabemas, very, very basic Japanese verb. It means to eat. Yeah? Tabemas. All right, so here's tabemas. Well, if we're assuming that we make potential verb forms for Ichidan verbs in the same way that we did for Godon verbs, then what would we do with tabemas? Would it become tabeemas? Tabeemas? There's nothing really for us to change from an E sound into an E sound here. And so I think that this becomes a problem for us, doesn't it? Yeah, I'm afraid it does. So instead of converting these verbs in the same way that we conjugated the Godon verbs, instead what we're going to have to do is we're going to have to create a new potential form for the Ichidan verbs that's going to end up looking like this. Tabemas becomes taberaremas. Taberaremas. I know that might be a little bit of a system shock. We've seen Godon verbs and Ichidan verbs behave differently in other cases, but this is very different, right? I want to note here that we're actually going to see something like a daremas form again in the future. It actually shows up once more in a totally different conjugation form, but that doesn't really matter. What does matter is that actually all Ichidan verbs are going to behave this exact same way. They're totally uniform. If it's an Ichidan verb, it's going to be uniform, and it's going to have this daremas ending, right? To make any Ichidan verb into the polite potential form, if we started with the polite form, the mas form, we just drop that mas and we add daremasu, right? So we had tabemasu, which became taberaremasu, and we have mimasu, which becomes miraremasu. Ne? That means I can see, miraremasu. And also, nemasu, which means to sleep, would become neraremasu. I can sleep. I'm able to sleep. Not true for me. I'm never able to sleep, but that doesn't matter. You don't need to worry about that in the slightest. I'm fine. I'm perfectly fine. This is all great. This is wonderful. Anyway, the nice thing too is that the plain form for these ichidan verbs is basically going to work the same way. So let's convert some of the same verbs into the plain potential form. Yeah? Okay. So we've got taberu, which is going to become taberareru. See what we did there? Right? We dropped the ru and we added rareru. Just like before, we dropped the mas and we added daremasu. Here, we're taking taberu and we're making taberareru, which means I can eat. I also think it sounds like really cute and sing-song. Taberareru. Ne? Kinda cute. ちょっと可愛いですね. Alright, so then we have miru, which is going to become mirareru. Easy. And neru, which will become nerareru. I can sleep. No problem there. Very, very easy. That's it. It's that easy. Taberu becomes taberareru. Miru becomes mirareru. And neru becomes nerareru. Before we move on to the negative forms of potential ichidan verbs, there's one thing that I need to tell you about miru. We talked about miru a second ago. Miru is an ichidan verb. So just like taberu, when miru conjugates into the potential form, it's going to become mirareru. That's exactly what we expect. No problem. However, there's actually another verb in the Japanese language that is pronounced mieru, and that verb means to be visible. And that sounds exactly like a godan type conjugation pattern, right? If miru were a godan verb, which it isn't, it would definitely conjugate as mieru in the potential form. If mimasu was a godan verb, which it isn't, it would definitely conjugate as miemasu in the potential form. But because mieru is already a verb, it's actually an ichidan verb as it turns out, and that means to be visible. Well, to be visible is basically the same word as I can see, right? And so both of these words kind of take up the same place in the language in terms of their semantics, in terms of what they mean. So because these two words, mirareru and mieru, both sort of kind of mean I can see, over time the language evolved in such a way that it sort of treats these two words as just slightly differently. Mirareru is usually used in cases where you have permission to see something. May I look at that? Hi, miraremasu. Yes, you can see it. But mieru is usually used in cases where you're able to see something. Can you see my screen? Hi, miemasu. Generally speaking, the potential form would usually, for almost all verbs, cover both of those cases, both permission and also ability. But because mirareru and mieru both occupy the same function in the Japanese language, they evolved to have slightly different nuances. Anyway, back to the lesson. The nai form and the masen form, the negative plain and the negative polite respectively, are also going to work in the same way. Standard, easy, uniform, very little problem here. So we've got taberu, and that's going to become taberarenai, right? So we've just added rarenai to say, I can't do that thing. I'm not able. And in the polite form, tabemasu would become taberaremasen. Taberaremasen. I can't eat. Polite. So the ichidan forms really aren't too hard. See, they're just a little bit jarring when we compare them to the godan verb forms, right? They just look totally different. They really do look very, very different, right? So ikemas, right? We created that by taking the ikimas and turning it into ikemas. But tabemas becomes taberaremas, right? It's definitely an extra step, and they look different. And the fact that they look different, I think it's notable, and it's something that you definitely want to think about. So it may sound, surprising, and it may sound very different, but I hope at least it makes a little bit of sense. Hopefully. So that just leaves our two irregular verbs. Surely you remember what the irregular verbs are, right? You remember, don't you? I really hope you remember. The irregular verbs are kuru and suru. So let's start with kuru. Okay. So kuru, to come, in the plain form, kuru becomes korareru. And the negative of that, I can't come, would be korarenai. And in the polite form, kimas becomes koraremasu. And in the negative, the masen form would become koraremasen. Do you remember me saying that eventually we would understand a lot better why the irregular verbs are considered irregular? Here's the evidence right here. Look how heckin' weird kuru is. In the plain potential form, it becomes korareru. I can come there. Or korarenai. I can't come there. And in the polite potential form, kimas becomes koraremasu or koraremasen. That's weird, right? It doesn't look like any other conjugation in this form, right? Totally different, totally different. Yeah. Unfortunately, that's just something that we have to memorize. Well, that is pretty weird, but what about suru? Well, what happens to suru in the potential form? If you want to know that, I'm afraid you're going to have to watch a different episode of this series. Specifically, you're going to have to watch the previous episode on dekiru, because, plot twist, dekiru was suru the entire time. Bam, bam, bam! Right? So suru becomes dekiru, and it also becomes dekinai, right? I can't do it. Dekinai. And in the polite form, shimas becomes dekimasu or dekimasen. I can't do it polite. Anyway, that's it. I hope you learned a lot about the potential form. Make sure that you let me know if you have any kind of questions or anything like that. I'm always waiting to listen for you, okay? So let me help you if I can. I want to. I want to help teaching you. Today I'm going to give you a bit of a challenge. For today's quiz, I'm going to ask you to conjugate some verbs into the potential form. Doesn't sound so bad, right? However, the tricky part is, I imagine that these verbs are probably going to be very new for you. They're a bit higher level, a bit more complex, and you maybe have never seen them before. But that's okay. We're going to treat this quiz as both the opportunity to practice your ability to create that potential form, which we know will be pretty uniform within those godan, ichidan, and irregular verb form patterns that we learned today, but also to treat this as a way to expose you to some new verbs that I imagine you've probably never seen before. So you get to test your skills and you get to learn something new. Sounds super fun, right? Nerd. Anyway, basically today I'm going to introduce you to some new verbs, and I'm going to ask you to give me the comparable potential form for that verb. I want the can do that form of the verb. And I want you to keep it in the same format. So if it's polite, please keep it polite. If it's plain, please keep it plain. If it's negative, please keep it negative. That should be pretty simple, right? It might be a little bit tricky, but just do your best. Let's try and let's see how you do. Oh, also, I'm going to give you a little bit less time today than I usually do. I gotta make it a bit of a challenge for you, don't I? Here's your first one. This is tanomimasu. Tanomimasu. Tanomimasu means to ask for something, to make a request of someone. we can tell that it's in the polite form because it ends in mas, right? And I'd like you to please keep it in the polite form. So how would you say, I can make a request? I have the ability to make a request. Yeah? Just do that conjugation for me, and I'll give you a few seconds. Did you say tanomemasu? Tanomemasu. Tanomu is a godan verb. Tanomu becomes tanomimasu in the polite form. And so the polite potential form for this verb, meaning to make a request, would be tanomemasu. That means I can make a request, or I can make an order. Tanomemasu. Ne? Let's move on to number 2. This next verb is yogoreru. Yogoreru. This is the plain form of the verb, and we can tell that because we look at it and we can see that it's probably an ichidan verb. How do you know? Because it ends in an eru sound, which would be difficult to conjugate in the potential verb form as we learned today. So your task is to put yogoreru into the plain potential form. We're going from yogoreru and we're making the I can get all dirty kind of form. Yeah? All right, do your best. Yogorerareru. It sounds funny, doesn't it? Yogorerareru. Yogorerareru. I kind of like it. But it makes sense because we knew that this was an ichidan verb. And in the plain form, all ichidan verbs conjugate by dropping the do and adding dareru. And so, yogoreru becomes yogorerareru. Ne? It's cute. All right, we're on a roll now, and I know you're doing great, so let's keep it up. Here's the next one. Maybe you actually recognize part of this word, actually. Yeah? It's katamari. Ne? Does that mean anything to you? Does katamari mean anything to you? Maybe something about a rolling ball collecting a bunch of stuff and getting all bunched up together? Maybe. Well, the name of that game comes from katamarimasu. Ne? But this is the negative form. It's katamarimasen. Ne? And that basically means to not get all bunched up. So how would you make the negative, polite, potential form meaning cannot get all bunched up? And the answer is katamaremasen. Katamaremasen. Otto. Was that one really hard? So katamaru is a godan verb, and therefore when making the polite positive or negative forms, what we're going to need to do is to change the e sound into an e sound, right? So katamarimasen becomes katamaremasen. That might be a little tough to remember, but please do your best. Ganbare! Again! Let's do it! Here's the next one. I think this one might actually be a little bit sneaky. So here we have karinai, which means to not borrow. The base verb is kariru. It's a verb that means to borrow or to rent, like I said, and here we're seeing it in the plain negative, karinai. Ne? So how are we going to make this into a potential plain negative verb? Did you get a little bit tripped up on this one? I think this is tough. This is another ichidan verb, so we need it to end in that darenai ending. It's not karenai, because kariru conjugates the same way as taberu or any other ichidan verb. So it ends up being karirarenai. Karirarenai. Ne? I think this one feels a little bit tricky because that riru ending feels a little bit ambiguous, and it might not be easy to tell if this is an ichidan or a godan verb. Remember, the hint is that a lot of ichidan verbs, like taberu and kariru, are going to end with two visible hiragana. right? Do you see that? Taberu ends in this beru, and both of those are hiragana. Kariru ends in riru, and both of those are hiragana. ですね. But a lot of godan verbs, like tsukuru and mamoru, will only end with just one hiragana. Do you see? Tsukuru, mamoru. See that? This is just a handy trick. It's not a perfect rule because it isn't always this way, but it often is. Anyway, how about one last one for the quiz? Okay, this one feels really confusing. This verb is o. It's just o. It means to chase someone or to drive them away from somewhere. It's in the plain form, and we recognize that. And it really feels like there's not a lot to work with there. But remember, we're challenging ourselves today, so I know you're going to do your best. How do we make the plain potential verb form for o? Are you able to figure it out? Okay, the answer was oeru. Oeru. I'll admit, this one does feel a little bit unfair. But yeah, what we want to do here is basically the same thing that we've done for any of our other godan verbs. O is a godan verb, and so it's going to follow the same pattern. What do we need to do? We need to change the final vowel sound to an e sound. And here, that's just e all by itself because it's being conjugated from u. And then at the end, we add ru. So we're just taking the u and we're turning it into an e and then adding ru. This is the same thing that we did with kaku becoming kakeru, or asobu becoming asoberu. Ne? It only feels different because we don't have a consonant in the u for o. It's tough, right? It's a little bit difficult. Okay, well, that's it for the quiz. Tell me if you have any questions. One thing, for your homework, what I would like you to do this week is to please write one sentence about something that you can do. Obviously, I want you to write that sentence in Japanese, please. But it can be anything. What can you do? You could write a sentence like, I can take my medicine. I need to take my medicine. Or you could write a sentence like, I can drink milk. I should drink something. Or you could write a sentence like, I can take over the world. I do have my own apocalypse. Anyway, it can be whatever you would like, and if I like your sentence, I may use it in a future episode. Do your best, okay? I hope you enjoyed today's lesson. Hey, by the way, did you know that I now have my own personal website? It's puppy-sensei.com. Puppy-sensei.com. If you've ever wondered how to schedule personal lessons directly with me, this is the easiest way to do it. You can reach out to me through my website and request private lessons. That's right, lessons directly with Puppy-Sensei, individually planned so that you can learn exactly what you want to learn and practice specific skills that are the most important to you. Want to learn how to be a better translator? I can help you with that. Want to learn anime-based Japanese? Well, that's based, but also I can do that. That's puppy-sensei.com. Go check it out, please. Alright, I will see you next week, and we'll do a full verb review. I think that it's important to take a step back at this point and make sure that we understand everything that we've covered so far about verbs. Verbs in Japanese, obviously, very, very important, as we saw today. So, until then, mata ne!